Oh, hey, you know, I love to read books, but the old school way is just so inconvenient. Lugging this around on the bus, trying to read it at work. There's got to be a better way. It's the 21st century. Oh, do I got a good audio story for you today? Check it out.
Recording by Mike Harris. The Man Upstairs by P.G.Wodehouse. Deep Waters. Historians of the social life of the late Roman Empire speak of a certain young man of Ariminum who would jump into rivers and swim in them. When his friends said, "You fish," he would answer, "Oh, pish. Fish can't swim like me, they've no vim in 'em." Just such another was George Barnard Callender. On land in his land clothes, George was a young man who excited little remark. He looked very much like other young men. He was much about the ordinary height. His carriage suggested the possession of an ordinary amount of physical strength. Such was George on shore. But, of course, remove his clothes, drape him in a bathing suit, and insert him in the water, and instantly, like the gentleman in The Tempest, he suffered a sea change into something rich and strange. Other men puffed, snorted, and splashed. George passed through the ocean with the silent dignity of a torpedo. Other men swallowed water, here a mouthful, there a pint, anon maybe a quart or so, and returned to the shore like floundering derelicts. George's mouth had all the exclusiveness of a fashionable club. His breaststroke was a thing to see and wonder at. When he did the crawl, strong men gasped. When he swam on his back, you felt that that was the only possible method of progression. George came to Marvis Bay at about 5 o'clock one evening in July. Marvis Bay has a well-established reputation as a summer resort, and, while not perhaps in every respect the paradise which the excitable writer of the local guidebook asserts it to be, on the whole it earns its reputation. Its sands are smooth and firm, sloping almost imperceptibly into the ocean. There is surf for those who like it, and smoother water beyond for those whose ideals in bathing are not confined to jumping up and down on a given jellyfish. At the northern end of the beach there is a long pier. It was to this that George made his way on his arrival. It was pleasant on the pier, once you had passed the initial zareba of fruit stands, souvenir stands, ice cream stands, and the lair of the enthusiast whose aim in life it was to sell you picture postcards, and had won through to the long walk where the seats were. You were practically alone with nature. At this hour of the day the place was deserted. George had it to himself. He strolled slowly along. The water glittered under the sun rays, breaking into a flurry of white foam as it reached the beach. A cool breeze blew. The whole scenic arrangements were a great improvement on the stuffy city he had left. Not that George had come to Mavis Bay with the single aim of finding an antidote to metropolitan stuffiness. There was a more important reason. In 3 days, Marvis Bay was to be the scene of the production of Fate's Footballs, a comedy in 4 acts by G. Barnard Callender. For George, though you would not have suspected it from his exterior, was one of those in whose cerebra the grey matter splashes restlessly about, producing strong curtains and crisp dialogue. The company was due at Marvis Bay on the following evening for the last spasm of rehearsals. George's mind, as he paced the pier, was divided between the beauties of nature and the forthcoming crisis in his affairs, in the ratio of 1/8 to the former and 7/8 to the latter. At the moment when he had left London, thoroughly disgusted with the entire theatrical world in general, and the company which was rehearsing Fate's Footballs in particular, rehearsals had just reached that stage of brisk delirium when the author toys with his bottle of poison, and the stage manner becomes icily polite. The foot pills, as Arthur Mifflin, the leading juvenile in the great play, insisted upon calling it, much to George's disapproval, was his first piece. Never before had he been in one of those kitchens where many cooks prepare and sometimes spoil the theatrical broth. Consequently, the chaos seemed to him unique. Had he been a more experienced dramatist, he would have said to himself, "'Twas ever thus." As it was, what he said to himself and others was more forcible. He was trying to dismiss the whole thing from his mind, a feat which had hitherto proved beyond his powers, when fate, in an unusually kindly mood, enabled him to do so in a flash, by presenting to his jaundiced gaze what on consideration he decided was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. When a man's afraid, shrewdly sings the bard, a beautiful maid is a cheering sight to see. In the present instance, the sight acted on George like a tonic. He forgot that the lady to whom an injudicious management had assigned the role of heroine in Fate's footballs, invariably, no doubt from the best motives, omitted to give the cynical roué his cue for the big speech in Act 3. His mind no longer dwelt on the fact that Arthur Mifflin, an estimable person in private life, and one who had been a friend of his at Cambridge, preferred to deliver the impassioned lines of the great renunciation scene in a manner suggesting a small boy, and a sufferer from nasal catarrh at that, speaking a piece at a Sunday school treat. The recollection of the hideous depression and gloom which the leading comedian had radiated in great clouds fled from him like some grisly nightmare before the goddess of day. Every cell in his brain was occupied to the exclusion of all other thoughts by the girl swimming in the water below. She swam well. His practiced eye saw that. Her strong, easy strokes carried her swiftly over the swell of the waves. He stared, transfixed. He was a well-brought-up young man, and he knew how ill-bred it was to stare, but this was a special occasion. Ordinary rules of conventional etiquette could not apply to a case like this. He stared. More, he gaped. As the girl passed on into the shadow of the pier, he leaned further over the rail, his neck extended in joints, much like a telescope. At this point, the girl turned to swim on her back. Her eyes met his. Hers were deep and clear, his bulging. For what seemed an eternity to George, she continued to look at him. Then, turning over again, she shot past onto the pier. George's neck was now at its full stretch. No power of will or muscle could add another yard to it. Realizing this, he leaned farther over the rail, and farther still. His hat slid from his hand. He grabbed at it, and overbalancing, fell with a splash into the water. Now, in ordinary circumstances, to fall 12 feet into the ocean with all his clothes on would have incommoded George a little. He would hardly have noticed it. He would have swum to shore with merely a feeling of amused self-reproach, akin to that of the man who absent-mindedly walks into a lamp-post in the street. When, therefore, he came to the surface, he prepared without agitation to strike out in his usual bold fashion. At this moment, however, two hands, grasping him beneath the arms, lifted his head still farther from the waves, and a voice in his ear said, "Keep still. Don't struggle. There's no danger." George did not struggle. His brain, working with the cool rapidity of a buzzsaw in an icebox, had planned a line of action. Few things are more difficult in this world for a young man than the securing of an introduction to the right girl under just the right conditions. When he is looking his best, he is presented to her in the midst of a crowd, and is swept away after a rapid handshake. When there is no crowd, he has toothache, or the sun has just begun to make his nose peel. Thousands of young lives have been saddened in this manner. How different was George's case! By this simple accident, he reflected, as, helping the good work along with an occasional surreptitious leg stroke, he was towed shorewards. There had been formed an acquaintanceship, if nothing more, which could not lightly be broken. A girl who has saved a man from drowning cannot pass him by next day with a formal bow. And what a girl, too! There'd been a time in extreme youth when his feminine ideal was the sort of girl who has fuzzy, golden hair and drops things. Indeed, in his first year at the university he had said and written as much to one of the type, the episode concluding with a strong little drama in which a wrathful, cheque-signing father had starred, supported by a subdued, misogynistic son. Which things, aided by the march of time, had turned George's tastes toward the healthy, open-air girl who did things instead of dropping them. The pleasantest functions must come to an end sooner or later, though, and in due season George felt his heels grate on the sand. His preserver loosed her hold. They stood up and faced each other. George began to express his gratitude as best he could. It was not easy to find neat, convincing sentences on the spur of the moment, but she cut him short. "Of course, it was nothing at all," she said, brushing the sea-water from her eyes. It was just lucky I happened to be there." "Oh, it was splendid," said the infatuated dramatist. "It was magnificent. He saw that she was smiling. "You're very wet," she said. George glanced down at his soaked clothes. It had been a nice suit once. "Hadn't you better hurry back and change into something dry?" Looking around about him, George perceived that sundry of the inquisitive were swooping down with speculation in their eyes. It was time to depart. "Have you far to go?" "Not far. I'm staying at the Beachview Hotel." "Why, so am I. I hope we shall meet again." "We shall," said George confidently. "How did you happen to fall in?" I was looking at something in the water." "Oh, I thought you were," said the girl quietly. George blushed. "I know," he said. "It was abominably rude of me to stare like that, but—" "You should learn to swim," interrupted the girl. "I can't understand why every boy in the country isn't made to learn to swim before he's 10 years old. And it isn't a bit difficult, really. I could teach you in a week." The struggle between George and George's conscience was brief. The conscience, weak by nature and flabby from long want of exercise, had no sort of chance from the start. "Oh, I wish you would," said George. And with those words he realized that he had definitely committed himself to his hypocritical role. Till that moment, explanation would have been difficult but possible. Now it was impossible. "I will," said the girl. "I'll start tomorrow, if you like." She waded into the water. "We'll talk it over at the hotel," she said hastily. "Here comes a crowd of horrid people. I'm going to swim out again." She hurried into deep water, while George, turning, made his way through a growing throng of goggling spectators. Of the 15 who got within speaking distance of him, 6 told him that he was wet. The other 9 asked him if he had fallen. Her name was Vaughan, and she was visiting Marvis Bay in company with an aunt. So much George ascertained from the management of the hotel. Later, after dinner, meeting both ladies on the esplanade, he gleaned further information, to wit that her first name was Mary, that her aunt was glad to make his acquaintance, liked Marvis Bay but preferred Trouville, and thought it was getting a little chilly and would go indoors. The elimination of the third factor had a restorative effect upon George's conversation, which had begun to languish. In feminine society, as a rule, he was apt to be constrained, but with Mary Vaughan it was different. Within a couple of minutes he was pouring out his troubles. The cue, withholding, leading lady, the stick-like Mifflin, the funereal comedian, up they all came, and she, gently sympathetic, was endeavouring, not without success, to prove to him that things were not as bad as they seemed. "It's sure to be all right on the night," she said. How rare is the combination of beauty and intelligence! George thought he had never heard such a clear-headed, well-expressed remark. "Well, I suppose it will," he said, "but they were very bad when I left. Mifflin, for instance, he seemed to think nature intended him for a Napoleon of advertising. He has a bee in his bonnet about booming the piece. Sits up at nights, when he ought to be sleeping or studying the part, thinking out new schemes for advertising the show. And the comedian, his specialty is drawing me aside and asking me to write in new scenes for him. I couldn't stand it any longer. I just came away and left them to fight it out among themselves." "Oh, I'm sure you have no need to worry," she said. "A play with such a good story is certain to succeed." George had previously obliged with a brief description of the plot of The Footpills. "Did you like the story?" he said tenderly. "Oh, I thought it was fine." "How sympathetic you are," cooed George glutinously, edging a little closer. "Do you know—" "Shall we be going back to the hotel?" said the girl. Those noisome creatures, the hired murderers of fate's footpills, descended upon Marvis Bay early next afternoon, and George, meeting them at the station, in reluctant pursuance of a promise given to Arthur Mifflin, felt moodily that if only they could make their acting one half as full of colour as their clothes, the play would be one of the most pronounced successes of modern times. In the forefront gleamed, like the white plumes of Navarre, the light flannel suit of Arthur Mifflin, the woodenest juvenile in captivity. His woodenness was, however, confined to stage rehearsals. It may be mentioned that once the run of a piece had begun, he was sufficiently volatile, and in private life he was almost excessively so, a fact which had been noted at an early date by the keen-eyed authorities of his university, the discovery leading to his tearing himself away from alma mater by request with some suddenness. He was a long, slender youth with green eyes, jet black hair, and a passionate fondness for the sound of his own voice. "Well, here we are," he said, kicking breezily at George's leg with his cane. "Yes, I saw you," said George, coldly sidestepping. "The whole team," continued Mr. Mifflin, "all bright body and trained to the minute." "Now, what happened after I left?" George asked. "Has anybody begun to act yet, or are they waiting till the dress rehearsal?" "Oh, the rehearsals," admitted Mr. Mifflin handsomely, "weren't perfect, but you wait. It'll be all right on the night." George thought he had never heard such a futile, vapid remark. "Besides," said Mr. Mifflin, "I have an idea which will make the show. Lend me your ear, both ears. Who shall have them back? Tell me, what pulls people into a theatre? A good play? Well, sometimes. But failing that, as in the present case, what? Fine acting by the leading juvenile? Ha, we have that. But it's not enough. No, my boy, advertising is the thing. Look at all these men on the beach. Are they going to roll in of their own free wills to see a play like The Footpills? Not on your life. About the time the curtain rises, every man of them will be sitting in his own private corner of the beach. How many corners do you think the beach has? Gazing into a girl's eyes, singing, 'Shine on, thou harvest moon,' and telling her how his boss is practically dependent on his advice. You know." "I don't," said George coldly. "Unless," proceeded Mr. Mifflin, "we advertise, and by advertise I mean advertise in the right way. We have a press agent, but for all the good he does, he might be back on the old farm gathering in the hay. Lucky for us, I am among those present. I have brains, I have what's that?" "I said nothing. I thought you did. Well, I have an idea which will drag these people like a magnet. I thought it out coming down in the train." "Oh, what is it?" "I'll tell you later. There are a few details to be worked upon first. Meanwhile, let us trickle to the seafront and take a sail in one of those boats. I am at my best in a boat. I rather fancy nature intended me for a Viking." Matters having been arranged with the financier to whom the boat belonged, they set forth. Mr. Mifflin, having remarked "Yo-ho" in a meditative voice, seated himself at the helm, somewhat saddened by his failure to borrow a quid of tobacco from the Ocean Beauty's proprietor. For, as he justly observed, without properties and make-up, where were you? George, being skilled in the way of boats, was in charge of the sheet. The summer day had lost its oppressive heat. The sun no longer beat down on the face of the waters. A fresh breeze had sprung up. George, manipulating the sheet automatically, fell into a reverie. A moment comes in the life of every man when an inward voice whispers to him, "This is the one." In George's case, the voice had not whispered, it had shouted. From now onward, there could be but one woman in the world for him. From now onward... The Ocean Beauty gave a sudden plunge. George woke up. "What the deuce are you doing with that tiller?" he inquired. "My gentle somnambulist," said Mr. Mifflin, aggrieved. "I was doing nothing with this tiller. We will now form a commission to inquire into what you were doing with that sheet. Were you asleep?" "My fault," said George. "I was thinking." "Well, if you must break the habit of a lifetime," said Mr. Mifflin complainingly, "I wish you would wait till we get ashore. You nearly upset us." "Oh, it shan't happen again. They're tricky, these sailing boats. Turn over in a second. Whatever you do, don't get a broadside on. There's more breeze out here than I thought there was." Mr. Mifflin uttered a startled exclamation. "Oh, what's the matter?" asked George. "Just like a flash," said Mr. Mifflin complacently. "It's always the way with me. Give me time, and the artistic idea is bound to come. Just some little thought, some little apparently obvious idea which stamps the man of genius. It beats me why I didn't think of it before. Why, of course, a costume piece with a male star is 100 times more effective." "What are you talking about?" "I see now," continued Mr. Mifflin, "that there was a flaw in my original plan. My idea was this. We were talking in the train about the bathing down here, and Jane happened to say she could swim some, and it suddenly came to me." Jane was the leading woman, she who omitted to give cues. "I said to myself, George is a sportsman. He'll be delighted to do a little thing like that." "Like to do what?" "Why, rescue Jane." "What?" "She and you," said Mr. Mifflin, "were to go in swimming together while I waited on the sands, holding our bone-headed press agent on a leash. About 100 yards from the shore, up go her arms, piercing scream, agitated crowds on the beach. What is the matter? What was happening? A touch of cramp. Will she be drowned? No! G. Barnett Callender, author of Fate's Footballs, which opens at the Beach Theatre on Monday evening next at 8:15 sharp, will save her. See, he has her. He is bringing her in. She is safe. How pleased her mother will be, and the public. What a bit of luck for them. They'll be able to see her act at 8:15 sharp on Monday after all. Back you come to the shore, cheering crowds, weeping women, strong situation. I unleash the press agent, and off he shoots in time to get the story into the evening paper. It was a great idea, but I see now there were 1 or 2 flaws in it. You do you? Said George. It occurs to me on reflection that after all you wouldn't have agreed to it. Something, I don't know what, which is lacking in your nature would have made you reject the scheme. And I'm certainly glad that occurred to you. And a far greater flaw was that it was too altruistic. It boomed you and it boomed Jane, but I didn't get a thing out of it. My revised scheme is 1,000 times better in every way. Don't say you have another. Oh, I have, and, added Mr. Mifflin with modest pride, it is a winner. This time I unhesitatingly assert that I have the goods. In about 1 minute from now you will hear me exclaim in a clear musical voice the single word, jump. That is your cue to leap over the side as quick as you can move, for at that precise moment the spanking craft is going to capsize. George spun round in his sheet. Mr. Mifflin's face was shining with kindly enthusiasm. The shore was at least 200 yards away, and that morning he had had his first swimming lesson. Why, a movement of the tiller will do it. These accidents are common objects of the seashore. I may mention that I can swim just enough to keep myself afloat. So it's up to you, dear boy. I wouldn't do this for everyone, but seeing that we were boys together, are you ready? Stop, said George. Don't do it. Listen. Are you ready? The Ocean Beauty gave a plunge. You lunatic, listen to me. Jump, said Mr. Mifflin. George came to the surface some yards from the overturned boat, and looking round for Mr. Mifflin, discovered that great thinker treading water a few feet away. Get to work, George, he remarked. It's not easy to shake one's fist at a man when in deep water, but George managed it. For tuppence, he cried, I'd leave you to look after yourself. Oh, you can do better than that, said Mr. Mifflin. I'll give you threepence to tow me in. Hurry up, it's cold. In gloomy silence, George gripped him by the elbows. Mr. Mifflin looked over his shoulder. Oh, we shall have a good house, he said. The stalls are full already. Oh, and the dress circle's filling. Work away, George. You're doing fine. This act is going to be a scream from start to finish. With pleasant conversation, he endeavored to while away the monotony of the journey. But George made no reply. He was doing some rapid thinking. With ordinary luck, he felt bitterly, all would have been well. He could have gone on splashing vigorously under his teacher's care for a week, gradually improving till he emerged into a reasonably proficient swimmer. But now, in an age of miracles, he might have explained away his present performance, but how was he to? And then there came to him an idea, simple as all great ideas are, but magnificent. He stopped and trod water. Tired? Said Mr. Mifflin. Well, take a rest, he added kindly. Take a rest. No need to hurry. Look here, said George. This piece is going to be recast. We're going to exchange parts. You're rescuing me. See, never mind why. I haven't time to explain it to you now. Do you understand? No, said Mr. Mifflin. I'll get behind you and push you, but don't forget, when we get to the shore, that you've done the rescuing. Mr. Mifflin pondered. Is this wise? He said. It is a strong part, the rescuer, but I'm not sure the other wouldn't suit my style better. The silent hand grip, the catch in the voice. You want a practiced actor for that. I don't think you'd be up to it, George. Never mind about me. That's how it's going to be. Mr. Mifflin pondered once more. No, he said at length, it wouldn't do. You mean well, George, but it would kill the show. We'll go on as before. Will we? Said George unpleasantly. Would you like to know what I'm going to do to you then? I'm going to hit you very hard under the jaw, and I'm going to take hold of your neck and squeeze it till you lose consciousness, and then I'm going to drag you to the beach and tell people I had to hit you because you lost your head and struggled. Mr. Mifflin pondered for the third time. You are? He said. I am. Then, said Mr. Mifflin cordially, say no more. I take your point. My objections are removed. But, he concluded, this is the last time I come bathing with you, George. Mr. Mifflin's artistic misgivings as to his colleague's ability to handle so subtle a part as that of a rescuee were more than justified on their arrival. A large and interested audience had collected by the time they reached the shore, an audience to which any artist should have been glad to play, but George, forcing his way through, hurried to the hotel without attempting to satisfy them. Not a single silent handshake did he bestow on his rescuer. There was no catch in his voice as he made the one remark which he did make, to a man with whiskers who asked him if the boat had upset. As an exhibition of rapid footwork, his performance was good. In other respects, it was poor. He had just changed his wet clothes. It seemed to him that he had been doing nothing but changing his wet clothes since he had come to Marvis Bay, when Mr. Mifflin entered in a bathrobe. "They lent me this downstairs," he explained, "while they dried my clothes. They would do anything for me. I am the popular hero. My boy, you made the mistake of your life when you threw up the rescuer part. It has all the fat. I see that now. The rescuer plays the other man off the stage every time. I've just been interviewed by the fellow on the local newspaper, his correspondent to a couple of London papers. The country will ring with this thing. I've told them all the parts I've ever played in my favorite breakfast food. There's a man coming up to take my photograph tomorrow. Footpills stock has gone up with a run. Wait till Monday and see what sort of house we shall draw. By the way, the reporter fellow said one funny thing. He asked if you weren't the same man who was rescued yesterday by a girl. I said, of course not, that you had only come down yesterday. But he stuck to it that you were. He was quite right. What? I was. Mr. Mifflin sat down on the bed. This fellow fell off the pier and a girl brought him in. George nodded. And that was you? George nodded. Mr. Mifflin's eyes opened wide. "Oh, it's the heat," he declared finally. "That and the worry of rehearsals. I expect a doctor could give the technical name for it. It's, what do you call it, an obsession. You often hear of cases. Fellows who are absolutely sane, really, but cracked on one particular subject. Some of them think they're teapots and things. You've got a craving for being rescued from drowning. What happens, old man? Do you suddenly get the delusion that you can't swim? No, it can't be that, because you were doing all the swimming for the two of us just now. I don't know, though. Maybe you didn't realize that you were swimming." George finished lacing his shoe and looked up. "Listen," he said, "I'll talk slow so that you can understand. Suppose you fell off a pier and a girl took a great deal of trouble to get you to the shore. Would you say, 'Much obliged, but you needn't have been so officious. I can swim perfectly well'?" Mr. Mifflin considered this point. Intelligence began to dawn in his face. "Oh, there is more in this than meets the eye," he said. "Tell me all." "This morning," George's voice grew dreamy, "she gave me a swimming lesson. She thought it was my first." "Don't cackle like that. There's nothing to laugh at." Oh, Mr. Mifflin contradicted this assertion. "Oh, there is you," he said simply. "This should be a lesson to you, George. Avoid deceit. In future, be simple and straightforward. Take me as your model. You have managed to scrape through this time. Don't risk it again. You are young. There is still time to make a fresh start. It only needs willpower. Meanwhile, lend me something to wear. They're going to take a week drying my clothes." There was a rehearsal at the Beach Theatre that evening. George attended it in a spirit of resignation and left it in one of elation. 3 days had passed since his last sight of the company at work, and in those 3 days, apparently, the impossible had been achieved. There was a snap and go about the piece now. The leading lady had at length mastered that cue, and gave it out with bell-like clearness. Arthur Mifflin, as if refreshed and braced by his saltwater bath, was infusing a welcome vigor into his part. And even the comedian, George could not help admitting, showed signs of being on the eve of becoming funny. It was with a light heart and a light step that he made his way back to the hotel. In the veranda were a number of basket chairs. Only one was occupied, and he recognized the occupant. "I've just come back from a rehearsal," he said, seating himself beside her. "Really? The whole thing is different," he went on buoyantly. "They know their lines. They act as if they meant it. Arthur Mifflin's fine. The comedian's improved till you wouldn't know him. I'm awfully pleased about it." "Really?" George felt damped. "Well, I thought you might be pleased, too," he said lamely. "Of course I'm glad that things are doing well. Your accident this afternoon was lucky, too, in a way, was it not? It will interest people in the play." "You heard about it?" "I've been hearing about nothing else." "Curious it happened so soon after." And so soon before the production of your play. Most curious." There was a silence. George began to feel uneasy. You could never tell with women, of course. It might be nothing, but it looked uncommonly as if... He changed the subject. "And how is your aunt this evening, Miss Vaughan?" "Quite well, thank you. She went in. She found it a little chilly." George heartily commended her good sense. A little chilly did not begin to express it. If the girl had been like this all the evening, he wondered her aunt had not caught pneumonia. He tried again. "Will you have time to give me another lesson tomorrow?" he said. She turned on him. "Mr. Calendar, don't you think this farce has gone on long enough?" Once in the dear dead days beyond recall, when but a happy child, George had been smitten unexpectedly by a sportive playmate a bare half-inch below his third waistcoat button. The resulting emotions were still green in his memory. As he had felt then, so did he feel now. "Miss Vaughan, I don't understand." "Really? What have I done?" "You have forgotten how to swim." A warm and prickly sensation began to manifest itself in the region of George's forehead. "Forgotten? Forgotten. And in a few months. I thought I had seen you before, and today I remembered. It was just about this time last year that I saw you at Hayling Island, swimming perfectly wonderfully, and today you are taking lessons. Can you explain it?" A frog-like croak was the best George could do in that line. She went on. "Business is business, I suppose, and a play has to be advertised somehow, but—" "You don't think," croaked George. "I should have thought it rather beneath the dignity of an author, but of course you know your own business best. Only I object to being a conspirator. I'm sorry for your sake that yesterday's episode attracted so little attention. Today it was much more satisfactory, wasn't it? I am so glad." There was a massive silence for about 100 years. "I think I'll go for a short stroll," George said. Scarcely had he disappeared when the long form of Mr. Mifflin emerged from the shadow beyond the veranda. "Could you spare me a moment?" The girl looked up. The man was a stranger. She inclined her head coldly. "My name is Mifflin," said the other, dropping comfortably into the chair which had held the remains of George. The girl inclined her head again, more coldly, but it took more than that to embarrass Mr. Mifflin. Dynamite might have done it, but not coldness. "The Mifflin," he explained, crossing his legs. "I overheard your conversation just now." "You were listening," said the girl, scornfully. "For all I was worth," said Mr. Mifflin. "These things are very much a matter of habit. For years I've been playing in pieces where I've had to stand concealed upstage, drinking in the private conversation of other people, and the thing has become a second nature to me. However, leaving that point for a moment, what I wish to say is that I heard you, unknowingly, of course, doing a good man a grave injustice. Mr. Calendar could have defended himself if he had wished. I was not referring to George. The injustice was to myself." "To you?" "I was the sole author of this afternoon's little drama. I like George, but I cannot permit him to pose in any way as my collaborator. George has old-fashioned ideas. He does not keep abreast of the times. He can write plays, but he needs a man with a big brain to boom them for him. So far from being entitled to any credit for this afternoon's work, he was actually opposed to it." "Then why did he pretend you had saved him?" she demanded. "George's," said Mr. Mifflin, "is essentially a chivalrous nature. At any crisis demanding a display of the finer feelings, he is there with the goods before you can turn around. His friends frequently wrangle warmly as to whether he is most like Bayard, Lancelot, or Happy Hooligan. Some say one, some the other. It seemed that yesterday you saved him from a watery grave without giving him time to explain that he could save himself. Well, what could he do? He said to himself, 'Well, she must never know,' and acted accordingly. But let us leave George and return." "Thank you, Mr. Mifflin." There was a break in her laugh. "I don't think there is any necessity. I think I understand now. It was very clever of you." "It was more than cleverness," said Mr. Mifflin, rising. "It was genius." A white form came to meet George as he re-entered the veranda. "Mr. Calendar," he stopped. "I'm very sorry I said such horrid things to you just now. I've been talking to Mr. Mifflin, and I want to say I think it was ever so nice and thoughtful of you. I understand everything." George did not, by a good deal, but he understood sufficient for his needs. He shot forward as if some strong hand were behind him with a needle. Miss Vaughan, Mary, I think I hear Aunt calling, said she. But a benevolent providence has ordained that aunts cannot call forever, and it is on record that when George entered his box on the 200th night of that great London success, Fate's Footballs, he did not enter it alone. End of story number 3, Deep Waters. Recording by Mike Harris. The Man Upstairs by P.G.Wodehouse. When Doctors Disagree is the story title. It's possible that at about the time at which this story opens, you may have gone into the Hotel Belvoir for a haircut. Many people did, for the young man behind the scissors, though of a singularly gloomy countenance, was undoubtedly an artist in his line. He clipped judiciously. He left no ridges. He never talked about the weather. And he allowed you to go away unburdened by any bottle of hair food. It's possible, too, that being there you decided that you might as well go the whole hog and be manicured at the same time. It's not unlikely, moreover, that when you had got over the first shock of finding your hands so unexpectedly large and red, you felt disposed to chat with the young lady who looked after that branch of the business. In your genial way you may have permitted a note of gay but gentlemanly badinage to creep into your end of the dialogue, in which case, if you had raised your eyes to the mirror, you would certainly have observed a marked increase of gloom in the demeanor of the young man attending to your apex. He took no official notice of the matter. A quick frown, a tightening of the lips, nothing more. Jealous as Arthur Welsh was of all who inflicted gay badinage, however gentlemanly, on Maud Peters, he never forgot that he was an artist. Never, even in his blackest moments, had he yielded to the temptation to dig the point of the scissors the merest fraction of an inch into a client's skull. But Maud, who saw, would understand, and if the customer was an observant man, he would notice that her replies at that juncture became somewhat absent, her smile a little mechanical. Jealousy, according to an eminent authority, is the hydra of calamities, the sevenfold death. Arthur Welsh's was all that and a bit over. It was a constant shadow on Maud's happiness. No fair-minded girl objects to a certain tinge of jealousy. Kept within proper bounds, it's a compliment. It makes for piquancy. It is the gin and the ginger beer of devotion. But it should be a condiment, not a fluid. It was the unfairness of the thing which hurt Maud. Her conscience was clear. She knew girls, several girls, who gave the young men with whom they walked out ample excuse for being perfect Othellos. If she had ever flirted on the open beach with the baritone of the troupe of Pierrots, like Jane Oddy, she could have excused Arthur's attitude. If, like Pauline Dicey, she had roller-skated for a solid hour with a black-moustached stranger while her fiancé floundered in Mugg's Alley, she could have understood his frowning disapprovingly. But she was not like Pauline. She scorned the coquetries of Jane. Arthur was the center of her world, and he knew it. Ever since the rainy evening, when he had sheltered her under his umbrella to her tube station, he had known perfectly well how things were with her, and yet just because in a strictly business-like way she was civil to her customers, he must scowl and bite his lip and behave generally as if it had been brought to his notice that he had been nurturing a serpent in his bosom. It was worse than wicked. It was unprofessional. She remonstrated with him. "It isn't fair," she said one morning when the rush of customers had ceased and they had the shop to themselves. Matters had been worse than usual that morning. After the days of rain and greyness, the weather had turned over a new leaf. The sun glinted among the bottles of unveiling lotion in the window, and everything in the world seemed to have relaxed and become cheerful. Unfortunately, everything had included the customers. During the last few days they had taken their seats in moist gloom, and, brooding over the prospect of coming colds in the head, had had little that was pleasant to say to the divinity who was shaping their ends. But today it had been different. Warm and happy, they had bubbled over with gay small talk. "It isn't fair," she repeated. Arthur, who was stropping a razor and whistling tunelessly, raised his eyebrows. His manner was frosty. "I fail to understand your meaning," he said. "You know what I mean. Do you think I don't see you frowning when I was doing that gentleman's nails?" The allusion was to the client who had just left, a jovial individual with a red face, who certainly had made Maud giggle a good deal. And why not? If a gentleman tells really funny stories, what harm is there in giggling? You have to be pleasant to people. If you snubbed customers, what happened? Why, sooner or later it got round to the boss, and then where were you? Besides, it was not as if the red-faced customer had been rude. Write down on paper what he had said to her, and nobody could object to it. Write down on paper what she had said to him, and you couldn't object to that either. It was just Arthur's silliness. She tossed her head. "I am gratified," said Arthur ponderously. In happier moments Maud had admired his gift of language. He read a great deal, encyclopedias and papers and things. "I am gratified to find that you had time to bestow a glance on me. You appeared absorbed." Maud sniffed unhappily. She had meant to be cold and dignified throughout the conversation, but the sense of her wrongs was beginning to be too much for her. A large tear splashed onto her tray of orange sticks. She wiped it away with the chamois leather. "It isn't fair," she sobbed. "It isn't. You know I can't help it if gentlemen talk and joke with me. You know it's all in the day's work. I'm expected to be civil to gentlemen who come in to have their hands done. Silly I should look sitting as if I'd swallowed a poker. I do think you might understand, Arthur, you being in the profession yourself." He coughed. "It isn't so much that you talk to them as that you seem to like—" He stopped. Maud's dignity had melted completely. Her face was buried in her arms. She did not care if 1,000,000 customers came in, all at the same time. "Maud!" She heard him moving towards her, but she did not look up. The next moment his arms were round her and he was babbling. And a customer, pushing open the door unnoticed 2 minutes later, retired hurriedly to get shaved elsewhere, doubting whether Arthur's mind was on his job. For a time this little thunderstorm undoubtedly cleared the air. For a day or two Maud was happier than she ever remembered to have been. Arthur's behavior was unexceptionable. He bought her a wristwatch, light brown leather, very smart. He gave her some chocolates to eat in the tube. He entertained her with amazing statistics culled from the weekly paper which he bought on Tuesdays. He was, in short, the perfect lover. On the second day the red-faced man came in again. Arthur joined in the laughter at his stories. Everything seemed ideal. It could not last. Gradually things slipped back into the old routine. Maud, looking up from her work, would see the frown and the bitten lip. She began again to feel uncomfortable and self-conscious as she worked. Sometimes their conversation on the way to the tube was almost formal. It was useless to say anything. She had a wholesome horror of being one of those women who nagged, and she felt that to complain again would amount to nagging. She tried to put the thing out of her mind, but it insisted on staying there. In a way, she understood his feelings. He loved her so much, she supposed, that he hated the idea of her exchanging a single word with another man. This, in the abstract, was gratifying, but in practice it distressed her. She wished she were some sort of foreigner so that nobody could talk to her, but then they would look at her, and that probably would produce much the same results. It was a hard world for a girl. Then the strange thing happened. Arthur reformed. One might almost say he reformed with a jerk. It was a parallel case to those sudden conversions at Welsh revival meetings. On Monday evening he had been at his worst. On the following morning he was a changed man. Not even after the original thunderstorm had he been more docile. Maud could not believe that at first. The lip once bitten was stretched in a smile. She looked for the frown. It was not there. Next day it was the same, and the day after that. When a week had gone by and still the improvement was maintained, Maud felt that she might now look upon it as permanent. A great load seemed to have been taken off her mind. She revised her views on the world. It was a very good world, quite one of the best, with Arthur beaming upon it like a sun. A number of eminent poets and essayists in the course of the last few centuries have recorded in their several ways their opinion that one can have too much of a good thing. The truth applies even to such a good thing as absence of jealousy. Little by little Maud began to grow uneasy. It began to come home to her that she preferred the old Arthur of the scowl and the gnawed lip. Of him she had at least been sure. Whatever discomfort she may have suffered from his spirited imitations of Othello, at any rate they had proved that he loved her. She would have accepted gladly an equal amount of discomfort now in exchange for the same certainty. She could not read this new Arthur. His thoughts were a closed book. Superficially, he was all that she could have wished. He still continued to escort her to the tube, to buy her occasional present, to tap, when conversing, the pleasantly sentimental vein. But now these things were not enough. Her heart was troubled. Her thoughts frightened her. The little black imp at the back of her mind kept whispering and whispering, till at last she was forced to listen. "He's tired of you. He doesn't love you anymore. He's tired of you." It is not everybody who in times of mental stress can find ready to hand among his or her personal acquaintances an expert counselor, prepared at a moment's notice to listen with sympathy and advise with tact and skill. Everyone's world is full of friends, relatives, and others who will give advice on any subject that may be presented to them, but there are crises in life which cannot be left to the amateur. It is the aim of a certain widely read class of paper to fill this void. Of this class, Fireside Chat is one of the best-known representatives. In exchange for 1 penny, its 500,000 readers received every week a serial story about life in highest circles, a short story packed with heart interest, articles on the removal of stains and the best method of coping with the cold mutton, anecdotes of royalty, photographs of peeresses, hints on dress, chats about baby, brief but pointed dialogues between Blogson and Snogson, poems, great thoughts from the dead and brainy, half hours in the editor's cozy sanctum, a slab of brown paper, and the journal's leading feature, Advice on Matters of the Heart. The weekly contribution of the advice specialist of Fireside Chat, entitled In the Consulting Room by Dr. Cupid, was made up mainly of answers to correspondence. He affected the bedside manner of the kind, breezy old physician, and probably gave a good deal of comfort. At any rate, he always seemed to have plenty of cases on his hands. It was to this expert that Maud took her trouble. She had been a regular reader of the paper for several years, and had indeed consulted the great man once before, when he had replied favorably to her query as to whether it would be right for her to accept caramels from Arthur, then almost a stranger. It was only natural that she should go to him now in an even greater dilemma. The letter was not easy to write, but she finished it at last, and after an anxious interval, judgment was delivered as follows. Well, bless my soul, what is all this? M.P. writes me. I am a young lady, until recently was very, very happy, except that my fiancé, though truly loving me, was of a very jealous disposition, though I am sure I gave him no cause. He would scowl when I spoke to any other man, and this used to make me unhappy. But for some time now he has quite changed, and does not seem to mind at all, and though at first this made me feel happy, to think that he had got over his jealousy, I now feel unhappy, because I am beginning to be afraid that he no longer cares for me. Do you think this is so, and what ought I to do? My dear young lady, I should like to be able to reassure you, but it is kindest sometimes, you know, to be candid, however it may hurt. It has been my experience that when jealousy flies out of the window, indifference comes in at the door. In the old days a knight would joust for the love of a lady, risking physical injury rather than permit others to rival him in her affections. I think, M.P., that you should endeavour to discover the true state of your fiancé's feelings. I do not, of course, advocate anything in the shape of unwomanly behaviour, of which I am sure, my dear young lady, you are incapable, but I think that you should certainly try to pique your fiancé, to test him. At your next ball, for instance, refuse him a certain number of dances, on the plea that your programme is full. At garden parties, at homes, and so on, exhibit pleasure in the society and conversation of other gentlemen, and mark his demeanour as you do so. These little tests should serve either to relieve your apprehensions, provided they are groundless, or to show you the truth. And after all, if it is truth, it must be faced. Must it not, M.P.? Before the end of the day, Maud knew the whole passage by heart. The more her mind had dwelt on it, the more clearly did it seem to express what she had felt, but could not put into words. The point about jousting struck her as particularly well taken. She had looked up joust in the dictionary, and it seemed to her that in those few words was contained the kernel of her trouble. In the old days, if any man had attempted to rival him in her affections, outside business hours, Arthur would undoubtedly have jousted, and jousted with the vigour of one who means to make his presence felt. Now, in similar circumstances, he would probably step aside politely as one who should say, "After you, my dear Alphonse." There was no time to lose. An hour after her first perusal of Dr. Cupid's advice, Maud had begun to act upon it. By the time the first lull in the morning's work had come, there was a chance for private conversation, and she had invented an imaginary young man, a shadowy Lothario, who, being introduced into her home on the previous Sunday by her brother Horace, had carried on in a way you wouldn't believe, paying all manner of compliments. "He said I had such white hands," said Maud. Arthur nodded, stropping a razor the while. He appeared to be bearing the revelations with complete fortitude. Yet only a few weeks before, a customer's comment on this same whiteness had stirred him to his depths. And this morning, what do you think? Why, he meets me as bold as you please, and gives me a cake of toilet soap. Like his impudence." She paused hopefully. "Always useful, soap," said Arthur, politely sententious. "Oh, lovely it was," went on Maud, duly conscious of failure, but stippling in like an artist the little touches which give atmosphere and verisimilitude to a story. "All scented. Horace'll tease me about it, I can tell you." She paused. Surely he must... Why, a sea anemone would be torn with jealousy at such a tale. Arthur did not even wince. He was charming about it, thought it very kind of the young fellow, didn't blame him for being struck by the whiteness of her hands, touched on the history of soap, which he had happened to have been reading up in the encyclopedia at the Free Library, and behaved altogether in such a thoroughly gentlemanly fashion that Maud stayed awake half the night, crying. If Maud had waited another 24 hours, there would have been no need for her to have taxed her power of invention. From the following day there entered the shop and her life a young man who was not imaginary, a Lothario of flesh and blood. He made his entry with that air of having bought most of the neighbouring property, which belongs exclusively to minor actors, men of weight on the stock exchange, and American professional pugilists. Mr. Skipper Shute belonged to the last named of the three classes. He had arrived in England 2 months previously for the purpose of holding a conference at 8 stone 4 with one Joseph Edwards to settle a question of superiority at that weight, which had been vexing the sporting public of 2 countries for over a year. Having successfully out-argued Mr. Edwards, mainly by means of strenuous work in the clinches, he was now on the eve of starting on a lucrative music-hall tour with his celebrated inaudible monologue. As a result of these things, he was feeling very, very pleased with the world in general, and with Mr. Skipper Shute in particular. And when Mr. Shute was pleased with himself, his manner was apt to be of the breeziest. He breezed into the shop, took a seat, and having cast an experienced eye at Maud, and found her pleasing, extended both hands and observed, "Go the limit, kid." At any other time Maud might have resented being addressed as kid by a customer, but now she welcomed it. With the exception of a slight thickening of the lobe of one ear, Mr. Shute bore no outward signs of his profession, and being, to use his own phrase, a swell dresser, he was really a most presentable young man. Just, in fact, what Maud needed. She saw in him her last hope. If any faint spark of his ancient fire still lingered in Arthur, it was through Mr. Shute that it must be fanned. She smiled upon Mr. Shute. She worked on his robust fingers as if it were an artistic treat to be permitted to handle them. So carefully did she toil that she was still busy when Arthur, taking off his apron and putting on his hat, went out for his 20 minutes' lunch, leaving them alone together. The door had scarcely shut when Mr. Shute bent forward. "Say," he sank his voice to a winning whisper, "you look good to me," he said gallantly. "The idea," said Maud, tossing her head. "On the level," Mr. Shute assured her. Maud laid down her orange sticks. "Don't be silly," she said. There, I've finished." "Well, I have not," said Mr. Shute, "not by a mile." "Say." "Well?" "What do you do with your evenings?" "I go home." "Sure, but when you don't, it's a poor heart that never rejoices. Don't you ever whoop it up?" "Whoop it up?" "The mad whirl," explained Mr. Shute. "Ice cream soda and buckwheat cakes and a happy evening at lovely Luna Park." "I don't know where Luna Park is." "What did they teach you at school? It's out in that direction," said Mr. Shute, pointing over his shoulder. You go straight on about 3,000 miles till you hit little old New York. Then you turn to the right. Say, don't you ever get a little treat? Why not come along to the White City some old evening? This evening. Mr. Welsh is taking me to the White City tonight. And who is Mr. Welsh? The gentleman who has just gone out. Is that so? Well, he doesn't look a live one, but maybe it's just because he's had bad news today. You never can tell. He rose. Farewell, Evelina, fairest of your sex. We shall meet again, so keep a stout heart. And taking up his cane, straw hat, and yellow gloves, Mr. Chute departed, leaving Maud to her thoughts. She was disappointed. She had expected better results. Mr. Chute had lowered with ease the record for gay badinage, hitherto held by the red-faced customer, yet to all appearances there had been no change in Arthur's manner. But perhaps he had scowled or bitten his lip, and she had not noticed it. Apparently he had struck Mr. Chute, an unbiased spectator, as gloomy. Perhaps at some point when her eyes had been on her work, she hoped for the best. Whatever his feelings may have been during the afternoon, Arthur was undeniably cheerful that evening. He was in excellent spirits. His light-hearted abandon on the wiggle-woggle had been noted and commented upon by several lookers-on. Confronted with the hairy anus, he had touched a high level of facetiousness, and now, as he sat with her listening to the band, he was crooning joyously to himself in accompaniment to the music, without, it would appear, a care in the world. Maud was hurt and anxious. In a mere acquaintance, this blithe attitude would have been welcome. It would have helped her to enjoy her evening. But from Arthur at that particular moment she looked for something else. Why was he cheerful? Only a few hours ago she had been, yes, flirting with another man before his very eyes. What right had he to be cheerful? He ought to be heated, full of passionate demands for an explanation, a flushed, throaty thing to be coaxed back into a good temper and then forgiven. All this at great length for having been in a bad one. Yes, she told herself, she had wanted certainty one way or another, and here it was. Now she knew. He no longer cared for her. She trembled. Cold, said Arthur. Let's walk. Evening's beginning to draw in now. Lum-da-diddly-ah. That's what I call a good tune. Give me something lively and bright. Dumpty-umpty-idly-ah. Dump-dump. Funny thing, said Maud deliberately. What's a funny thing? The gentleman in the brown suit whose hands I did this afternoon. He was, agreed Arthur brightly, a very funny thing. Maud frowned. Wit at the expense of hairy anus was one thing, at her own another. I was about to say, she went on precisely, that it was a funny thing, a coincidence, seeing that I was already engaged, that the gentleman in the brown suit whose hands I did this afternoon should have asked me to come here, to White City, with him tonight. For a moment they walked on in silence. To Maud it seemed a hopeful silence. Surely it must be the prelude to an outburst. Oh, he said, and stopped. Maud's heart gave a leap. Surely that was the old tone. A couple of paces and he spoke again. I didn't hear him ask you. His voice was disappointingly level. He asked me after you'd gone out to lunch. Oh, it's a nuisance, said Arthur cheerfully, when things clash like that. But perhaps he'll ask you again. Nothing to prevent you coming here twice. Well, repay's a second visit, I always say. I think you shouldn't, said a voice behind him. It hurts the head. Well, kid, being shown a good time? The possibility of meeting Mr. Chute had not occurred to Maud. She had assumed that, being aware that she would be there with another, he would have stayed away. It may, however, be remarked that she did not know Mr. Chute. He was not one of your sensitive plants. He smiled pleasantly upon her, looking very dapper in evening dress, and a silk hat, though a size too small for him, shone like a mirror. Maud hardly knew whether she was glad or sorry to see him. It did not seem to matter much now, either way. Nothing seemed to matter much, in fact. Arthur's cheery acceptance of the news she had received invitations from others had been like a blow, leaving her numb and listless. She made the introductions. The two men eyed each other. Pleased to meet you, said Mr. Chute. Weather keeps up, said Arthur. And from that point onward, Mr. Chute took command. It is to be assumed that this was not the first time Mr. Chute had made one of a trio in these circumstances, for the swift dexterity with which he lost Arthur was certainly not that of a novice. So smoothly was it done that it was not until she emerged from the witching waves, guided by the pugilist's slim but formidable right arm, that Maud realized that Arthur had gone. She gave a little cry of dismay. Secretly, she was beginning to be somewhat afraid of Mr. Chute. He was showing signs of being about to step out of the role she had assigned to him and attempt something on a larger scale. His manner had that extra touch of warmth which makes all the difference. "Oh, he's gone!" she cried. "Sure," said Mr. Chute. "He's got a hurry-up call from the UG village. The chief's cousin wants a haircut." "We must find him. We must." "Surest thing you know," said Mr. Chute. "Plenty of time." "We must find him." Mr. Chute regarded her with some displeasure. "Seems to be ace high with you, that dub," he said. "I don't understand you." "My observation was," explained Mr. Chute coldly, "that, judging from appearances, that dough-faced lemon was a Willie boy, the first and only love." Maud turned on him with flaming cheeks. "Mr. Welsh is nothing to me. Nothing, nothing," she cried. She walked quickly on. "Well, then, if there's a vacancy, Star Eyes," said the pugilist at her side, holding on a hat which showed a tendency to wobble, "count me in." "Directly I saw you. See here, what's the idea of this road work? We aren't racing." Maud slowed down. "That's better. As I was saying, directly I saw you, I said to myself, that's the one you need, the original Candy Kid." His hat lurched drunkenly as he answered the girl's increase of speed. He cursed it in a brief aside. "That's what I said. The original Candy Kid. So—" He shot out a restraining hand. "Arthur!" cried Maud. "Arthur!" "That's not my name," breathed Mr. Chute tenderly. "Call me Clarence." Considered as an embrace, it was imperfect. At these moments, a silk hat a size too small handicaps a man. The necessity of having to be careful about the nap prevented Mr. Chute from doing himself complete justice. But he did enough to induce Arthur Welsh, who, having sighted the missing ones from afar, had been approaching them at a walking pace, to substitute a run for the walk and arrive just as Maud wrenched herself free. Mr. Chute took off his hat, smoothed it, replaced it with extreme care, and turned his attention to the newcomer. "Arthur," said Maud. Her heart gave a great leap. There was no mistaking the meaning in the eye that met hers. He cared. He cared. "Arthur." He took no notice. His face was pale and working. He strode up to Mr. Chute. "Well," he said between his teeth. An 8 stone champion of the world has many unusual experiences in life, but he rarely encounters men who say "well" to him between their teeth. Mr. Chute eyed this freak with profound wonder. "I'll teach you to kiss young ladies." Mr. Chute removed his hat again and gave it another brush. This gave him the necessary time for reflection. "I don't need it," he said. "I've graduated." "Put them up," hissed Arthur. Almost a shocked look spread itself over the pugilist's face. So might Raphael have looked if requested to draw a pavement picture. "You aren't speaking to me," he said incredulously. "Put them up." Maud, trembling from head to foot, was conscious of one overwhelming emotion. She was terrified, yes, but stronger than the terror was the great wave of elation which swept over her. All her doubts had vanished. At last, after weary weeks of uncertainty, Arthur was about to give the supreme proof. He was going to joust for her. A couple of passers-by had paused, interested to watch developments. You could never tell, of course. Many an apparently promising row never got any farther than words. But glancing at Arthur's face, they certainly felt justified in pausing. Mr. Chute spoke. "If it wasn't," he said carefully, "that I don't want trouble with the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, He broke off, for to the accompaniment of a shout of approval from the two spectators, Arthur had swung his right fist, and it had taken him smartly on the side of the head. Compared with the blows Mr. Chute was wont to receive in the exercise of his profession, Arthur's was a gentle tap, but there was one circumstance which gave it a deadliness all its own. Achilles had his heel. Mr. Chute's vulnerable point was at the other extremity. Instead of countering, he uttered a cry of agony and clutched wildly with both hands at his hat. He was too late. It fell to the ground and bounded away with its proprietor in passionate chase. Arthur snorted and gently chafed his knuckles. There was a calm about Mr. Chute's demeanour as, having given his treasure a final polish and laid it carefully down, he began to advance on his adversary, which was more than ominous. His lips were a thin line of steel. The muscles stood out over his jawbones. Crouching in his professional manner, he moved forward softly, like a cat. And it was at this precise moment, just as the 2 spectators, reinforced now by 11 other men of sporting tastes, were congratulating themselves on their acumen in having stopped to watch, that Police Constable Robert Bryce, intruding 14 stones of bone and muscle between the combatants, addressed to Mr. Chute these memorable words, "Hello, hello, 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 hello." Mr. Chute appealed to his sense of justice. "The mutt knocked my hat off." "And I'd do it again," said Arthur truculently. "Not while I'm here, you wouldn't, young fella," said Mr. Bryce, with decision. "I'm surprised at you," he went on, pained. "And you look a respectable young chap, too. You pop off." A shrill voice from the crowd at this point offered the constable all cinematograph rights if he would allow the contest to proceed. "And you pop off, too, all of you," continued Mr. Bryce. "Blessed if I know what kids are coming to nowadays. And as for you," he said, addressing Mr. Chute, "all you got to do is to keep that face of yours closed. That's what you got to do. I got my eye on you, mind, and if I catch you a-follering of him," he jerked his thumb over his shoulder at Arthur's departing figure, "I'll pinch you. Sure as you're alive." He paused. "I'd have done it already," he added pensively, "if it wasn't my birthday." Arthur Welsh turned sharply. For some time he had been dimly aware that somebody was calling his name. "Oh, Arthur," she was breathing quickly. He could see the tears in her eyes. "I've been running. You walked so fast." He stared down at her gloomily. "Go away," he said. "I've done with you." She clutched at his coat. "Arthur, listen. It's all a mistake. I thought you didn't care for me any more, and I was miserable, and I wrote to the paper and asked what should I do, and they said I ought to test you and try and make you jealous, and that would relieve my apprehensions, and I hated it, but I did it. And you didn't seem to care till now. And you know that there's nobody but you." "You? The paper? What?" he stammered. Yes. I wrote to Fireside Chat, and Dr. Cupid said that when jealousy flew out the window, indifference came in at the door, and that I must exhibit pleasure in the society of other gentlemen and mark your demeanour. Oh, so well. Oh." Arthur, luckier than Mr. Chute, was not hampered by a too small silk hat. It was a few moments later, as they moved slowly towards the flip-flap, which had seemed to both of them a fitting climax for the evening's emotions, that Arthur, fumbling in his waistcoat pocket, produced a small slip of paper. "What's that?" Maud asked. "Read it," said Arthur. "It's from Home Moments, in answer to a letter I sent them." And he added with heat, "I'd like to have 5 minutes alone with the chap who wrote it." And under the electric light, Maud read, "Answers to Correspondence by the Heart Specialist. Arthur W. Jealousy, Arthur, is not only the most wicked, but the most foolish of passions. Shakespeare said, 'It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on.' You admit that you have frequently caused great distress to the young lady of your affections by your exhibition of this weakness. Exactly. There is nothing a girl dislikes or despises more than jealousy. Be a man, Arthur W. Fight against it. You may find it hard at first, but persevere. Keep a smiling face. If she seems to enjoy talking to other men, show no resentment. Be merry and bright. Believe me, it's the only way." End of Chapter 4, Story number 4, When Doctors Disagree. Recording by Mike Harris.